What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you enjoyed the episode, hit that like and subscribe button, and let's just dig right in. Settler colonialism is inherently genocidal in terms of the Genocide Convention. We talked about that in the last episode. If you need to get a refresher, go do it real quick. In the case of the British North American colonies and the United States, not only extermination and removal were practiced, but also the disappearing of the prior existence of indigenous peoples. And this continues to be perpetuated in local histories. Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, historian Gene O'Brien names this practice of writing Indians out of existence firsting and lasting. All over the continent, local histories, monuments, and signage narrate the story of first settlement. The founders, the first school, first dwelling, first everything, as if there had never been occupants who thrived in those places before Euro-Americans. On the other hand, the national narrative tells of last Indians or last tribes, such as the last of the Mohicans, Ishi the last Indian, the end of the trail, as a famous sculpture by James Earl Fraser is titled. Documented policies of genocide on the part of U.S. administrations can be identified in at least 4 distinct periods. The Jacksonian era of forced removal, the California Gold Rush in Northern California, the post-Civil War era of the so-called Indian Wars in the Great Plains, and the 1950s termination period, all of which are discussed in the following chapters. Cases of genocide carried out as policy may be found in historical documents as well as in the oral histories of indigenous communities. An example from 1873 is typical, with General William Tecumseh Sherman writing, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even discriminate as to age." As Patrick Wolf has noted, the peculiarity of settler colonialism is that the goal is elimination of indigenous populations in order to make land available to settlers. That project is not limited to government policy, but rather involves all kinds of agencies, voluntary militias, and the settlers themselves acting on their own. In the wake of the U.S. 1950s termination and relocation policies, a pan-indigenous movement arose in tandem with the powerful African-American civil rights movement and the broad-based social justice and anti-war movements of the 1960s. The indigenous rights movement succeeded in reversing the U.S. termination policy. However, repression, armed attacks, and legislative attempts to undo treaty rights began again in the late 1970s, giving rise to the International Indigenous Movement, which greatly broadened the support for indigenous sovereignty and territorial rights in the United States. The early 21st century has seen increased exploitation of energy resources, begetting new pressures on indigenous lands. Exploitation by the largest corporations, often in collusion with politicians at local, state, and federal levels, and even with some indigenous governments, could spell a final demise for indigenous land bases and resources. Strengthening indigenous sovereignty and self-determination to prevent that result will take general public outrage and demand, which in turn will require that the general population, those descended from settlers and immigrants, know their history and assume responsibility. Resistance to these powerful corporate forces continues to have profound implications for U.S. socio-economic and political development in the future. There are more than 500 federally recognized indigenous communities and nations comprising nearly 3 million people in the United States. These are the descendants of the 15 million original inhabitants of the land, the majority of whom were farmers who lived in towns. The U.S. establishment of a system of Indian reservations stemmed from a long British colonial practice in the Americas. In the era of U.S. treaty making from independence to 1871, the concept of the reservation was one of the indigenous nation reserving a narrowed land base from a much larger one in exchange for U.S. government protection from settlers and the provision of social services. In the late 19th century, as indigenous resistance was weakened, the concept of the reservation changed to one of land being carved out of the public domain of the United States as a benevolent gesture or a gift to the indigenous peoples. Rhetoric changed so that reservations were said to have been given or created for Indians. With this shift, Indian reservations came to be seen as enclaves within state boundaries. Despite the political and economic reality, the impression to many was that indigenous people were taking a free ride on public domain. Beyond the land bases within the limits of the 310 federally recognized reservations among 554 indigenous groups, indigenous land, water, and resource rights extend to all federally acknowledged indigenous communities within the borders of the United States. This is the case whether within the original or subsequently acquired territory thereof, and whether within or without the limits of a state, and includes all allotments as well as rights of way running to and from them. Not all the federally recognized indigenous nations have land bases beyond government buildings, and the lands of some native nations, including those of the Sioux in the Dakotas and Minnesota and the Ojibways in Minnesota, have been parceled into multiple reservations, while some 50 indigenous nations that have been removed to Oklahoma were entirely allotted, divided by the federal government into individual native-owned parcels. Attorney Walter R. Echo Hawk writes, in 1881, Indian land holdings in the United States had plummeted to 156 million acres. By 1934, that's 53 years later, only about 50 million acres remained, an area the size of Idaho and Washington. As a result of the General Allotment Act of 1887, during World War II, the government took 500,000 more acres for military use. Over 100 tribes, bands, and rancherias relinquished their lands under various acts of Congress during the termination era of the 1950s. By 1955, the indigenous land base had shrunk to just 2.3% of its original size. As a result of federal land sales, seizures, and allotments, most reservations are severely fragmented. Each parcel of tribal, trust, and privately held land is a separate enclave under multiple laws and jurisdictions. The Diné Nation was the largest contemporary contiguous land base among native nations, nearly 16 million acres, or nearly 25,000 square miles, the size of West Virginia. Each of 12 other reservations is larger than Rhode Island, which comprises nearly 800,000 acres or 1,200 square miles. And each of 9 other reservations is larger than Delaware, which covers nearly 1.5 million acres or 2,000 square miles. Other reservations have land bases of fewer than 32,000 acres or 50 square miles. A number of independent nation states with seats in the United Nations have less territory and smaller populations than some indigenous nations of North America. Following World War II, the United States was at war with much of the world, just as it was at war with the indigenous peoples of North America in the 19th century. This was total war, demanding that the enemy surrender unconditionally or face annihilation. Perhaps it was inevitable that the earlier wars against indigenous peoples, if not acknowledged and repudiated, ultimately would include the world. According to the origin narrative, the United States was born of rebellion against oppression, against empire, and thus is the product of the first anti-colonial revolution for national liberation. The narrative flows from that fallacy, the broadening and deepening of democracy, the Civil War and the ensuing Second Revolution, which ended slavery, the 20th century mission to save Europe from itself twice, and the ultimately triumphant fight against the scourge of communism, with the United States inheriting the difficult and burdensome task of keeping order in the world. It's a narrative of progress. The 1960s social revolutions ignited by the African American liberation movement complicated the origin narrative, but its structure and periodization have been left intact. After the 1960s, historians incorporated women, African Americans, and immigrants as contributors to the Commonwealth. Indeed, the revised narrative produced the Nation of Immigrants framework, which obscures the U.S. practice of colonization. I almost did that again. The practice of colonization, merging settler colonialism with immigration to metropolitan centers during and after the Industrial Revolution. Native peoples, to the extent that they were included at all, were renamed First Americans, and thus themselves cast as distant immigrants. The provincialism and national chauvinism of U.S. history production make it difficult for effective revisions to gain authority. Scholars, both indigenous and a few non-indigenous, who attempt to rectify the distortions are labeled advocates, and their findings are rejected for publication on that bias. Indigenous scholars look to research and thinking that has emerged in the rest of the European colonized world to understand the historical and current experiences of indigenous peoples in the United States These thinkers and writers draw upon and creatively apply the historical materialism of Marxism, the liberation theology of Latin America, Frantz Fanon's psychosocial analyses of the effects of colonialism on the colonizer and the colonized, and other approaches including development theory and postmodern theory. That was a mouthful. While not abandoning insights gained from those sources due to the exceptional nature of U.S. colonialism among 19th century colonial powers, indigenous scholars and activists are engaged in exploring new approaches. This book claims to be a history of the United States from an indigenous people's perspective. But there is no such thing as a collective indigenous people's perspective. Just as there is no monolithic Asian or European or African people's perspective. This is not a history of the vast civilizations and communities that thrived and survived between the Gulf of Mexico and Canada, and between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific. Such histories have been written and are being written by historians of Diné, Lakota, Mohawk, Tlingit, Muskogee, Anishinaabe, Lumbee, Inuit, Kiowa, Cherokee, Hopi, and other indigenous communities and nations that have survived colonial genocide. This book attempts to tell the story of the United States as a colonialist settler state. One that, like colonialist European states, crushed and subjugated the original civilizations in the territories it now rules. Indigenous peoples, now in a colonial relationship with the United States, inhabited and thrived for millennia before they were displaced to fragmented reservations and economically decimated. This is a history of the United States. And that's the end of the introduction. And I don't want to go on to chapter 1. I like to keep it separated. So I'm going to thank you for joining me here. Ask you to hit that like and subscribe button, and ask you to hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I make a new video. YouTube also has been known to unsubscribe people who listen to stuff like this that challenges the establishment narrative. So until next time we meet, thanks for joining me.